Chapter 22 from George Ivanovich Gurdjieff's Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. Beelzebub in Tibet for the first time. As the route proposed for the journey through Tibet was very rarely used by the three-brained beings of those days, and we could not count on joining one of their caravans, I had to organize one of my own, and I began at once to make preparations and to lay in all the supplies we would need along the way. I procured some scores of the quadruped beings called horses, mules, donkeys, Chamianian goats, and so forth, and hired a number of your biped favorites to look after them and to carry out the semi-conscious work required for this mode of travel. As soon as I had got together everything necessary, I set off, accompanied by a hoon. This time we passed through still stranger regions, where the nature of that ill-fated planet was even more extraordinary, and we encountered, or rather, there came within the field of our vision, a much greater number of the various one-brained and two-brained beings which are called wild, and which at that time came there from remote parts of the continent of Ashark, in order to hunt for prey, that is, to procure their first being food. These wild beings were then particularly dangerous, not only for the three-brained beings, but also for the quadruped beings that your favorites, with the cunning proper to them, had already made their slaves, compelling them to work solely for the satisfaction of their egoistic needs. And these wild beings were particularly dangerous because just at that period there was being crystallized in their presences, again due to the abnormal conditions of being existence, established by the three-brained beings there, a special function about which I shall tell you at the proper time. It was chiefly on account of these wild beings that the regions through which our route lay were almost inaccessible to the three-brained beings of that period. It was possible for them to pass through these places only, as they say, by day, that is, when in the atmosphere of their planet the process of Aiuiwa takes place in the active element Okidanok. They could travel by day because during this time of the Crentonalnian position of their planet in relation to their sun, almost all the wild beings were in the being state called sleep. That is, in the state in which the energy necessary for their ordinary existence is automatically elaborated in their presences, and this takes place in them during just this time. Whereas in three-centered beings, on the contrary, energy is elaborated only when that same sacred process is not occurring in the atmosphere, that is to say, during what they call night. And so, my boy, your favorites could pass through these places only by day. At night, great vigilance was required, and they had to erect artificial shelters to protect themselves and their belongings from the wild beings. For during that period of the Crentonalnian position of the planet Earth, these wild beings are wide awake and take their first being food. And since by then they had become accustomed to using for this purpose chiefly the planetary bodies of weaker beings of other forms arising on their planet, they would prowl about at night and seize such beings in order to make use of their planetary bodies to satisfy this need. These wild beings, particularly the smallest ones, were already perfected to the highest degree in wiliness and cunning, of course also owing to the abnormally established conditions of ordinary being existence of the three-brained beings there. So, all along our route, we, and especially those we had hired for the semi-conscious work, had to be extremely watchful and alert at night in order to protect ourselves, our quadruped workers, and our supplies. A pack of wild beings would gather around our camp at night, having come there to pounce on something suitable for their first being food. They were rather like a mob of your favorites on the floor of the stock exchange or at an election of representatives to some society or other whose nominal aim is the common pursuit of a means to a happy existence for all their fellow beings, regardless of their notorious castes. We kept huge fires burning all night to scare away the wild beings, and our biped workers, although forbidden to do so, destroyed with poisoned Kilnapara arrows the ones that came too near our camp. Yet not a single night passed without some of what are called lions, tigers, and hyenas carrying off one or more of our quadruped beings, so that their number shrank daily. It is true, my boy, that this way back to the Sea of Beneficence took us much longer than the way we had come, but what we saw and heard during our journey of the strangeness of the psyche of your favorites fully justified the extra time spent. We traveled under these conditions for more than a month of their time and finally came upon a small settlement of three-brained beings who, as we learned, had only recently migrated there from Pearl Land. The name of this settlement was Sinkratorza, and later on, when the surrounding region was populated, this place became its chief center. The whole country also came to be known by that name, though afterward the name was changed several times and it is now called Tibet. As we came upon these beings, just when night was falling, we asked them for shelter. And when they gave us permission to stay in their settlement, we were very glad at the prospect of a night's rest, for we were all so exhausted by the constant warfare with the wild beings that it was imperative for us, especially for our biped workers, to spend at least one night in peace. In the course of the conversation that evening, it transpired that all the beings of this settlement belonged to a sect well known in Pearl Land, under the name of the Self-Tamers, formed by followers of that very religion which, as I have already told you, purported to be based on the direct instructions of Saint Buddha. In this connection, I might mention that the beings of your planet have yet another particularity that long ago became proper to them alone, which consists in this, that no sooner does some new Havat Virnoni or religion arise among them than its followers begin to split up into different camps, and each of these soon forms what is called a sect of its own. The strangest thing about this particularity of theirs is that those who belong to such a sect never call themselves sectarians, as the name is considered offensive. They are called this only by those who do not belong to their sect. And the adherents of a sect are sectarians for others only as long as they have no guns and ships at their disposal. But as soon as they get hold of enough guns and ships, what had been a particular sectarian doctrine at once becomes the dominant religion. The beings, both of this settlement and of many other districts in Pearl Land, had become sectarians after having broken away from the religion whose doctrine I had studied in detail, and which later was known as Buddhism. This sect of the Self-Tamers arose owing to that distorted understanding of one of the principles of the Buddhist religion, which, as I have already told you, they called suffering in solitude. And it was in order to give themselves up to this famous suffering, without hindrance from others like themselves, that these beings with whom we spent the night had settled so far away from their own people. Now, my boy, everything I learned that night and saw the next day of the devotees of that sect made such a painful impression upon me that for many of their centuries I could never recall it without shuddering. And so I should like to tell you in some detail about what I then saw and learned. During our conversation that evening, I learned that while still in Pearl Land, before their migration to this isolated place, the leaders of this sect had invented a special form of suffering. They had decided to withdraw to some inaccessible place where other beings, not belonging to their sect, and not initiated into its arcana, would be unable to prevent them from inflicting upon themselves this particular form of suffering they had invented. After a long search, they finally found this place that we had come upon by chance, and saw that it was well suited to their purpose. As they were already solidly organized and materially secure in the face of great difficulties, they migrated with their families to this place, which was almost inaccessible to their ordinary countrymen, and which, as I have already said, they named Sinkratorza. At first, while they were settling down in this new place, they existed more or less in harmony. But when they began actually putting into practice the special form of suffering they had invented, their families, and particularly their wives, having discovered what that form of suffering really was, rebelled and made a great outcry, which resulted in a schism. This schism had occurred not long before our arrival at Sinkratvortsa, and already small groups were beginning to migrate to new places that they considered even more suitable for an isolated existence. For a better understanding of what follows, you will need to know the principal cause of the schism among these sectarians. It turned out that the leaders of the sect, while they were still in Pearland, had pledged themselves to withdraw completely from beings like themselves, and to stop at nothing in order to attain liberation from the consequences of the properties of that organ of which the divine teacher, Saint Buddha, had spoken. Their pledge committed them to exist in a certain way until their planetary bodies were completely destroyed. In other words, until their death. And the purpose of this special form of existence was to purify what they called their souls of all the alien deposits due to that organ kunda buffer which, as Saint Buddha had told them, their ancestors had once possessed. And having freed themselves from these consequences, they would acquire the possibility, as the divine teacher had also said, of reblending with the all-embracing holy prana. But when they had settled down and begun to put into practice this special form of suffering, and their wives, on learning its true nature, had rebelled, many of these sectarians, under the influence of their wives, declined to carry out the obligations they had assumed in Pearland, and as a result, they split up into two independent parties. From then on, these sectarians, formerly called the self-tamers, began to be called by different names. Those who remained faithful to the obligations they had taken upon themselves were called orthodox Haiduraki, while those who had renounced certain of the obligations assumed in their native land were called Katoshki Haiduraki. At the time of our arrival in Sinkratvortsa, the sectarians, named Orthodox Haiduraki, had established, not far from their original settlement, a well-organized monastery where their special form of suffering was in full swing. The next day, on resuming our journey, after a restful night, we passed very near this monastery at the Orthodox Haiduraki sect of the Buddhist religion. And as it was the hour of day when we usually made a halt to feed our quadruped workers, we asked the monks to allow us to stop for a while in the shelter of their monastery. Strange and unusual as it may seem, these beings who bore the name of monk did not refuse our objectively just request, but admitted us at once, without any of the swaggering that has become proper there throughout the centuries to monks of all doctrines. Thereupon, we unexpectedly found ourselves in the holy of holies of this doctrine, just that sphere which the beings of the planet Earth from the very beginning have been so ingenious in hiding from observation. In other words, they become so skillful at wiseacring and making a mystery of something, and then so thoroughly concealing this mystery by all sorts of means, that even beings with pure reason cannot penetrate to the heart of it. The monastery of the Orthodox Haiduraki sect of the Buddhist religion occupied a large square surrounded by a massive wall, which protected those within from beings of their own kind and from wild beings. In the center of this vast walled enclosure stood a large, solidly built structure that formed the main part of the monastery. In one half of this building, the monks carried on their ordinary being existence, and in the other they practiced those manipulations that were the special feature of the belief of their sect, but which to outsiders were arcana. Along the inner side of the encircling wall, and built solidly into the wall itself, was a row of small, cell-like compartments set close together, and it was precisely in the nature of these cell-like structures that lay the difference between this monastery and monasteries in general on the planet Earth. These sentry box structures were entirely walled in on all sides, except for a small opening near the bottom, through which, with great difficulty, a hand could be thrust. It was within these cells that the deserving members of the sect were to be perpetually immured, and there they were to occupy themselves with certain manipulations of what they call their emotions and thoughts, until the total destruction of their planetary existence. And it was when the wives of these sectarians known as self-tamers found out about all this that they raised their great outcry. In the religious teaching of this sect, there was a final explanation of just what manipulations had to be practiced on oneself and for how long, in order ultimately to merit being immured in one of these cells, there to receive once every 24 hours a piece of bread and a small jug of water. When we were admitted within the walls of that terrible monastery, every one of these monstrous cells was occupied, and the care of the immured, that is, giving them once every 24 hours through the tiny opening a piece of bread and a small jug of water, was undertaken with great reverence by other sectarians, themselves candidates for immurement, who, while awaiting their turn, existed in the large building in the center of the monastery square. Your immured favorites did indeed remain in those monstrous sepulchres until their motionless and half-starved existence, so full of deprivation, came to an end. As soon as the companions of the immured learned that one of them had ceased to exist, his planetary body was removed from the improvised sepulchre, and at once, in place of the being who had thus destroyed himself, another unfortunate fanatic of that maleficent religious teaching was walled up. And the ranks of these fanatical monks were always being filled with other members of that peculiar sect, constantly coming from Pearl Land. In Pearl Land itself, all the adherents of that sect already knew of the existence of this specially convenient place for accomplishing the crowning act of their religious doctrine, which was supposedly based on the exact instructions of St. Buddha, and in every large center they even had what are called agents to help them get there. Having rested and fed our biped and quadruped workers, we left behind us that melancholy place of sacrifice to the wretched organ which, according to the ruminations of certain most high cosmic individuals, for some reason or other, had to be implanted in the presence of the former three-brained beings of that ill-fated planet. "Ah, my boy," sighed Beelzebub. "As you can imagine, it was scarcely with agreeable sensations or happy reflections that we departed from that place. Continuing our route toward the Sea of Beneficence, we again passed through a region having high projections of many different forms, with conglomerations of interplanetary minerals that had erupted to the surface from great depths. Here I must say something about an exceedingly strange fact I observed concerning that part of the surface of your planet. The first time I passed through this region now called Tibet, its peaks were, it is true, unusually far above the surface of the earth, but did not differ particularly from similar elevations on other continents or on the continent of Ashark or Asia, of which Tibet is a part. But during my sixth and last personal sojourn on the planet Earth, when my way took me once more through those memorable regions, I observed that in no more than a few score of their centuries, the whole of this region had projected so far above the rest of the planet that no heights on any of the other continents could even be compared with it. For instance, the principal chain of peaks in the region we were passing through, which the beings there called a mountain range, had in the interval projected so far upward that some of its peaks are to this day the loftiest of all the abnormal projections of that vainly long-suffering planet. And I dare say that if you climbed one, you might perhaps be able, with the aid of a Tescuanu, to distinguish clearly the opposite side of this peculiar planet. When I first observed that strange phenomenon taking place on your highly original planet, I at once thought that it very likely contained the germ for the arising of some future misfortune on a great cosmic scale. Later, when I made a statistical study of that abnormal phenomenon, my first apprehension grew all the more. And it grew all the more because in one section of my statistics it was shown that the height of the mountain chain increased from decade to decade. The same section also showed when and how terrestrial planetary tremors, or as your favorites call them, earthquakes, occur as a result of the excessive height of those Tibetan peaks. Although planetary tremors or earthquakes are often provoked in that planet of yours by other intraplanetary disharmonies resulting from the two great Transapollonian perturbations, whose causes I will someday explain to you. Nevertheless, most of the planetary tremors there, especially in recent centuries, have taken place solely on account of those excessive elevations. And this is because, due to these excessive elevations, equally disproportionate projections have arisen in the presence of the atmosphere of that planet. In other words, what is called the Blastigochlornian sphere of the atmosphere of the Earth has acquired, and in certain places continues to acquire, a materialized presence that projects too far to permit the reciprocal blending of the results of all the planets of that system. Thus, during the movement of the Earth, in the course of the process known as the common system harmony, its atmosphere hooks on, as it were, at certain times to the atmospheres of other planets or comets of that system. And, owing to these hookings on, planetary tremors or quakes occur in corresponding places in the common presence of your planet. I must also explain to you that the region of the common presence of the planet where these tremors occur depends upon the position occupied by the planet itself in the process of the common system harmonious movement in relation to other concentrations of the same system. Be that as it may, if this abnormal growth of the Tibetan mountains continues, sooner or later a catastrophe on a general cosmic scale is inevitable. However, if this menace I perceive becomes evident, the Most High, most sacred cosmic individuals will no doubt take the proper measures at the proper time. Please, your right reverence, interrupted Ahun, and he rattled off the following. Allow me to report to your right reverence some information I happened to pick up about the growth of those Tibetan mountains you have deigned to mention. Just before our flight from the planet Caritas, continued Ahun, I had the pleasure of meeting the Archangel Veluar, the governor of our solar system, and his magnificence condescended to recognize me and to speak with me. Perhaps your right reverence remembers that while we were existing on the planet Zernakur, his magnificence, the Archangel Veluar, was still an ordinary angel and often used to drop in to see us. So during our conversation, when his magnificence heard me mention the name of the solar system, where we had been exiled, he told me that at the last, most high, most sacred reception of finally reintegrated cosmic results, a certain individual, Saint Lama, had the privilege, in the presence of all the sacred individuals, of personally presenting at the feet of our endless unibeing a petition regarding the abnormal growth of some of the elevations of a planet belonging apparently to that solar system. And our all-gracious endlessness, granting his request, immediately commanded that the Archangel Luisos be sent to that solar system, where, as one already familiar with it, he might clarify on the spot the causes of these projections and take appropriate measures. That is why his conformity, the Archangel Luisos, is just now hurriedly winding up his current affairs in order to set off for that planet. Good, dear Ahun, commented Beelzebub, and he added, Thank you for this information. Glory be to our Creator. What you have just said will undoubtedly help to destroy the anxiety that arose in my presence when I first noticed the abnormal growth of those Tibetan mountains, namely my anxiety that the precious memory of our wisest of the wise, the infinitely revered Mullah Nasser ad-Din, might completely disappear from the universe. Having said this, and allowing his face to assume its customary expression, Beelzebub went on. We continued our journey through the region now called Tibet, encountering hardships of every kind, and we finally came to the source of the river, named Karyachi. A few days later, sailing down the river to the Sea of Beneficence, we regained our ship Occasion. After this third descent of mine to the planet Earth, I did not go there again in person for a considerable period. Nevertheless, from time to time I observed these favorites of yours attentively through my big Tescuano. And I did not go there for a long time for the following reason. Soon after returning to Mars, I became interested in an enterprise that the Martian three-brained beings were just then carrying out on the surface of their planet. To understand what this undertaking was that I became interested in, you must know that the planet Mars is for the system Ors, to which it belongs, a Mdnel Haushian link in the transformation of cosmic substances. Consequently, it has a Keskestasantinian firm surface. That is to say, one half of its surface consists of land presence, and the other of Salia Coreopnian masses, or, as your favorites would say, one half of it is land in one continuous continent, and the other half is covered with water. So, my boy, as the three-brained beings of the planet Mars use only prosphora, or as your favorites call it bread, for their first being food, they always sow wheat on the land half of their planet. But since the wheat derived the moisture it needed for the evolving jartklom only from what is called dew, the yield from one grain of wheat was only a seventh part of the total process of the sacred heptaparaparshinok. That is to say, the entire yield was only 1/7. As this amount of wheat was insufficient for their needs, and in order to get more, they would have to utilize the planetary Salia Coriop. The three-centered beings there had been talking, ever since our arrival, of bringing the necessary quantity of Salia Coriop from the opposite side of the planet to the side where their being existence proceeded. Several of their years later, they finally decided the question and made the necessary preparations. And just before I returned from the planet Earth, they set to work digging special canals for conducting the Salia Coriop. This undertaking, my boy, was extremely complicated, and to carry it out, the beings of the planet Mars were constantly inventing all sorts of machines and appliances, among which were many original and ingenious ones. And as I was always interested in any new invention, I was very much taken by this work. By the courtesy of those kind Martians, I spent nearly all my time at these works, and that is why during this period I very seldom descended to the other planets of that solar system. Occasionally, however, for a rest, I flew to the planet Saturn to visit Gornahur Harhark, who meanwhile had become my real essence friend, and to whom I am indebted for such a marvel as my big Tescuano, which, as I have already told you, increases the visibility of remote concentrations 7,285 times.